Hello everybody, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Wolfram Laaser. I have been working in media development and instructional design for more than 30 years at the German distance teaching university at Hagen. In this video lecture, I will tell you a bit about some of my work, showing a series of examples. My academic background is economics. However, when I started my job at Fernuniversity in Hagen, I switched to media and pedagogy. Many of my applications, therefore, are related to problems in economics, although the underlying principles are valid also for other academic disciplines. Let me tell you a bit about my personal motivation. Before I started to study economics, I had spent about 3 years as an apprentice in a big industrial company in Berlin. However, at that time I had to use percentage calculations of interest rates, discount rates, financial mathematics, and I had forgotten all about differential calculus and integration, for example. So when I started economics, then I had to learn something about probability theory, about advanced mathematics, and I found that really hard to understand. And I think that's why I was later on very much motivated in my work as an instructional designer to ease understanding of complex learning tasks for students that may have similar difficulties as I have had them. Now let me explain some of the basic principles that guided my work and that I will illustrate with examples later on. One of the obstacles for a student is, why should I learn that? What is it good for? So I try to relate workplace experience outside the university with textbook lectures about theoretical concepts. The interesting thing was that to establish such a link is far from being easy. Real-world applications, especially in industry, are very special, often with an overload of internal technical terms. So to match somehow theory with real applications means to reduce also the complexity of reality to its essential features. So even the presentation of cases and practical applications undergo a didactic treatment before it can be presented as teaching content. Now the second principle somehow relates as well to the reduction of complexity. A complex graph in a textbook can be reduced and explained by stepwise presentation in a way that the whole complex graph appears almost at the end of a sequence. So to split a complex task into subsequent steps is another important methodology. Now, the third principle is a systematic and functional use of layout patterns, such as colors, fonts, and graphical patterns, or music. This is an important element to emphasize structure and relationships between elements. The fourth element that I would like to mention is to create metaphors, examples or stories, and maybe even humor to illustrate a concept and to make it that way more persistent in the memory of the learner. Now, let us start with a series of examples to illustrate these guiding principles. Our first example is a simple multiple choice exercise taken from a course on introductory mathematics. The additional element is a cartoon to comment the right or wrong selection. So here's our example. Determine the derivative of the following function. And we can try to solve it with the rule of sums. So you see that we can get a negative comment, and if we try chain rule,
Yoo-hoo, I am a champion.
You get a positive feedback. Although you cannot stress humor too much, as exercises may be repeated several times and then the effect of humor loses its stimulus. However, it's an element that breaks a pattern of dull drill and practice test batteries. The next example is still very simple. It uses a graph from the course book and translates it directly into an exercise. This is another principle of didactic design. The context of the original graph is maintained, and so the graph can be recalled easier. Contextualization is an important issue, therefore. So here you can see the original graph of a textbook example, and I just left some parts of the graph in blank to insert either AND or XOR, and check whether this is correct or not. So if we try AND here, we probably get the right solution. Another similar example stems from a little story about a working day of the manager Ralf Berger. The tasks he has to accomplish are reported, and the student has to decide which role Raphael Berger is fulfilling in each of the different situations. So with illustrating the daily tasks by changes of the clock related to job tasks creates a little interesting case out of a traditional multiple choice exercise. So this is a graphical presentation of the different tasks that the manager Raphael Berger has to fulfill. If you rotate the clock, then you get different tasks. The example is in German, but I think it is still understandable. And the student has to choose the role that Raphael Berger is fulfilling in solving the different tasks. For example, here he is calling one of his employees about progress in production, and so he functions as a collector of information. So this would be the correct answer. Our next example is embedded in another kind of small case situation. A role play is filmed in a very short take with no professional actors, and students have to analyze then the behavior of the head of section and the employee. The result of the analysis can then be compared with an expert commentary. So here we will show a short role play that at least in part reflects actual German leadership behaviors. On the stage we will see Dr. Sutter, who is already since 20 years with the company. Actually, he is head of research and development. Also, we will have Dr. Jäger. She is senior in rank since 2 months when she joins the company's top management. Dr. Sutter is now her direct subordinate. Through her secretary, she invites Dr. Sutter for an interview. So we will play first a little scene.
Dr. Sutter, come in and take a seat.
Thank you.
As you know, I took over management of this area 2 months ago. Of course, a couple of things have to be changed. There is one thing I'm particularly interested in, and that's information.
Yes?
I want to ask you to give me from now on a weekly report on all project activities.
Sorry, up until now we are used to coordinating project management under our own responsibility.
You will be responsible for that in the future as well, however, with the reservation that I may streamline activities here and there.
Yes, but don't you think that my co-worker then will get the impression that our confidence isn't sufficient?
But I'm sure you'll be able to communicate that to them, won't you? And basically, that's your problem. Any more questions?
Oh, not at the moment.
Okay then, that's it for today. You can leave now, Dr. Sutter.
Now students have to answer some questions about this little role play. and about leadership style of Dr. Jäger. So he can enter his text here, and then he can compare that with a model solution. The next example in this first series of examples is a concept developed by the psychologist Calder about when a person is considered a leader. Of course, you can try to learn all these characteristics by heart and then to repeat them in a final exam. But much more motivating and lasting is it when you learn it by a little illustrative story around the concept of leadership. Now, in this specific case, I chose as an illustration the behavior of a group of football players. I tried to get photos of social and emotional situations between famous football players and tried to relate these photos with steps in the attribution process of leadership characteristics according to Calder. So, in this case, finally, Oliver Kahn, famous German goalkeeper, turned out to be accepted as a leader in view of his fellow players.
Let us apply the flowchart of Calder's attribution model to a real-life situation and demonstrate the different steps and ideas with an example taken from professional team sport. Also in sport teams, during the transcourse of interactions between team members, there will come up a so-called team leader. This process is grounded on different processes of perception and attribution of personality traits. Therefore, players will observe actions and statements of the other players and value them to draw some conclusions with regard to potential leadership abilities. This will help them to understand and structure the complex reality of the internal team relationships. Basis for such an attribution task undertaken by a potential non-leader or follower are the stereotype preconcepts they acquired in former situations concerning leadership attributes.
The example shows that by looking for metaphors and concrete examples or illustrations, visualization is much easier than with the abstract underlying concepts. Now, let us proceed with some examples using simple animation techniques. In economics, often complex transformations of equations are presented by teachers in a fast and often non-repeatable way. Even their writing on a blackboard of the mathematical terms may not be very clear. So here a simple animation that can be repeated 1,000 times if necessary is a simple but very efficient way of helping the student. So this is a little example taken from macroeconomics.
As we want to increase public expenditure, all other constants remain unchanged. Therefore, we can set changes of all other constants equal to 0, namely dt, dm, dw, and dk. To prepare for the next steps, we want to reduce our equation system to 3 equations by substituting endogenous variables. In our case, we want to eliminate just one variable, that is dy, according to the third equation.
Another related issue is the transition of one situation or representation to the next. With tweening effects, these transitions can be shown explicitly, which otherwise could only be indicated by arrows or hand signs.
In the initial situation, we suppose that the quantity x1 is produced. To achieve that, we need an amount of labor L1 and an amount of capital C1. Now, if we consider an increase in the wage rate, the linear cost curve rotates clockwise until it touches the isoquant x1 in point B.
Showing transitions is even more important if graphs have to be rotated between two states of art. A good example is the famous Edgeworth's box from microeconomics.
Let's rotate the system of coordinates of the individual Schulze by 180 degrees and move it up to the upper diagram so that on the horizontal axis
The third example of simple animations brings us back to small real case applications. Here, a decision model of Lufthansa Airlines to deal with customer complaints is split up into 16 mini-sequences to reduce the complexity of the diagram.
A client contacts Lufthansa AirPlus to complain about his bill. The responsible employee starts a new case in the workflow management system EasyFlow. The first step is to register the complaint. All data have to be registered and classified. EasyFlow communicates then all data to the bookkeeping section. The employee then proposes a certain discount. If this discount exceeds 500 euros, the head of the bookkeeping section has to authorize this issue. He receives then the issue of authorization in his task list. Once the authorization is given, the financial department will make the respective financial arrangement and the process terminates.
An effective way to illustrate different cultural perceptions of individuals is to design cartoons, for example, and let them dialogue in a role play. In this case, to make it more authentic, it is underlined by using native speakers, or if not available, to at least imitate them.
I am interested in your personal experience and observations concerning communication with Germans. Did Germans behave different from what you expected, and what has been for you not understandable at all or difficult to interpret?
In fact, there are huge differences between German and Chinese mentality.
Do you remember a concrete situation in this regard? Something that you experienced or observed yourself?
At the moment, not really, maybe only in general terms.
I am interested in your personal experience and observations.
You can see that in the source file, sound is related to mouse movement, either open or closed, of the two protagonists. The examples shown so far can be created with a relatively simple design and animation tool such as Flash. To create simulations of more complex environments, programming abilities are really required. Now, the first example in this section shows how three-dimensional representations are changed in response to parameter changes. Often in economic applications, the difficulties of imagining functions in a three-dimensional space is a substantial obstacle and frustrates learners. The visual display and the interactive possibilities give a better feeling of being able to master these difficulties. However, programming is quite complex and done here with Java. Our next example is about the famous traveling salesman problem. to find the shortest circuit or shortest round trip. Here the student can compare and test different algorithms and their capacity to find that shortest round trip between different locations. A complex simulation environment gives room for proper comparative experiments to ease understanding of the efficiency of complex algorithms. I think the idea is clear even if the example is taken from a multimedia production in German language. The following example is taken from the same multimedia production and shows how a certain mathematical definition can be explained intuitively by developing in parallel mode a simple illustration of the problem.
Beim Übergang von der aktuellen zu einer benachbarten Lösung mittels eines Moves
So here we have three elements. The formal general definition of the attributes, which is explained in different ways, first by an audio commentary, then by a simple graphical illustration, here by presenting faces with different attributes such as mouth, nose, and color. And finally, the possibility is given to simulate an experiment by pointing at different arrows of the graph and checking the resulting attributes. So in just one web page, we have the theoretical definition, a graphical illustration, and facilities to self-test the proper understanding. That means that we integrate in one web page the otherwise usually separated instructional steps of concept, application, and exercise. Now, in this section, I will show you several larger sequences of instructional TV transmissions. In an instructional film about just-in-time production, we explained the problem of a production loop according to the famous Kanban principle, first by showing the principle as simple abstract animation. Then the production circle is demonstrated in its real environment as part of a car production assembly line. Finally, a manager explains why he established this concept and what the economic benefits have been.
Wenn wir früher die Schiebedächer in 10 Tages- oder zum Teil Monatsfertigung gebracht haben, dann bringen wir heute diese.
So, to show a problem from different angles and with different presentation formats is an important element to make for deeper and richer learning. The next example is about European personnel management. In this TV series, we looked at how different sized enterprises prepare and adjust to the existence of the European market. So we started with a small handicraft enterprise, then portrayed a medium-sized enterprise that begins to internationalize its activities and organization, and finally showing a multinational in his adjustment policies. So you can observe another well-known principle. Start with something easy to understand and then proceed to more complex examples. What we also use here are systematic summaries supported visually by repeating symbols, like the European flag, to indicate that a summary is starting. I will play just a summary of the first video about European personnel management.
In general, we can differentiate between 4 basic forms. The ethnocentric type, with a strong national orientation, the bilateral or multi-centered company, the regiocentric approach, and finally, the worldwide multinational multicultural business. Our construction company in the Eifel certainly belongs to the ethnocentric type, despite the fact that they've opened a subsidiary in Luxembourg. The workers are all German. The firm Eismann is in the process of changing from a strongly national orientation to a more multi-centered emphasis. The company Eurocopter is a good example of a typical bilateral corporate culture. Finally, Hochowens has already passed through the bilateral stage by establishing bases in several European countries.
The third example that I would like to show is about charismatic leadership. Here, the structure of the instructional film follows the steps of showing first interest-rising examples from famous charismatic leaders, then discussing a definition of charismatic leadership, and then going on with a concrete historical example of a leader who had to reorganize a former socialist enterprise. And we end with a task for students to analyze 2 interviews to detect characteristics of leadership. So let's listen to some parts of the DVD.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
Wir brauchen eine positive Grundstimmung. Wir brauchen den Glauben daran, dass wir es auch tatsächlich schaffen können.
People often speak about charisma and don't actually know where the word comes from. It comes from the Bible. The Apostle Paul uses the word in the 1 Corinthians and in Romans, and it comes from the Greek word charis, grace. So a charisma is a gift of grace that comes from God.
It's a good feeling if after 12 years you look how it was and how it is now. A lot that was planned went right, some things went right by chance, and lots of unplanned things got in the way. That's why I have to say that being in Jena for 12 years has been the godsend of my life.
Mr. Giesmann, you have worked at Jenoptik's board of directors with Lothar Späth for several years, but I believe cooperation began much earlier.
Yes, if you can talk about a cooperation, then that is true.
Both of the film clips show how theoretical concepts such as leadership or market challenges can be illustrated and related to what is happening outside the walls of the university. This is important both for motivation and for understanding. However, it is not just a simple illustration of technical terms or concepts with some real-life images added later on. It is much more about discovering how the insights of theory can be retraced in the way people act and think at their workplace or in their private environment. Before I end this series of demonstrations, I will discuss briefly a design element that has always attracted my personal attention and interest. Maybe also because I'm a hobby musician myself. So I will not omit to spend some remarks on the use of music. Music can be used in short animation clips as well as in larger instructional film productions, of course. However, I found that this element is often either neglected or overemphasized. Music, or just acoustic signals, can be used very effectively to repeat important steps of a solution, while dropping at that time the explanatory audio command completely. To give an example, I selected a small part of a production about trim loss problems from the area of operations research, where acoustic signals accompany the filling of a matrix with data from a trim loss problem. Unfortunately, often a permanent stimulus of background music is used even jointly with an audio commentary and a number of actions performed on the screen, thereby neglecting the fact that a permanent stimulus loses its effect after a while and that perception can be blocked or disturbed by the multiple channels used. Music is very apt to create a familiar association with the topics presented. Just listen to two short titles from instructional films that I produced. I must, however, apologize for the low quality of the digitized tapes. It is a frequent mistake in instructional video design to start from a narrative audio comment and to add only afterwards some illustrative images to make it a movie. Usually academics think in terms of text and not in terms of images. Basically, with video, it should go the other way around. The image should be in the lead position, and the audio comment just should complement and, if necessary, help to interpret these images. At the end, let me give an example to illustrate meaningful use of some principles of the theory of human perception. In a production about analysis of paintings, I reduced or dropped completely even the accompanying audio command when the camera was moving, zooming, or traveling. The command continues when the camera pauses. So the old saying that talking is silver, but silence is gold, has a definite relevance in filming.
That Emil Schumacher keeps to his own style of painting shows another painting dated from 1990. Iridescent blue, black and white show both the strength of the material and the artist's power of design.
Now let me summarize what I wanted to show you. I think it is an important task for teachers and instructional designers to teach by reduction of complexity, by showing applications of non-trivial examples, and by using adequate layout patterns to support processing of structural elements. And these principles are not obsolete in times of Web 2.0 and user-created content. We have to reduce the information overload of web content, where different symbols are used, colors and fonts change from one web page to the next, where the content does not always match smoothly going from one site to the next, and where the changing context does not always correspond exactly to the actual and specific needs of the learner. And finally, where commercials and menu items distract from the academic content. And these ideas hold whoever is producing, be it a student or be it a teacher. Students often will feel insecure about actual correctness and relevance of the content. So, to conclude, the teacher's role therefore cannot be reduced simply to moderate students' learning in distributing interesting links, but has to process and appropriate the difficult content for himself, and then to present the content in an adequate format to communicate his understanding and to ease that way students' understanding. Being able to do this appropriately, he will also be in a good position to guide students in their own construction of knowledge.